Incoming! Take cover! The shells screamed hellishly as they flew overhead. The ground shook with their thunderous impacts. Great plumes of earth and smoke were thrown up into the air with each hit. Somewhere close by a man was screaming for his mother. The air was filled with the cracks of rifles, the chatter of machine guns and the roars of rage-filled, desperate men. The rain was falling heavily, turning the ground into a muddy quagmire. Jason's heart was hammering in his chest. He was certain that at any moment one of those damned green traces that were whizzing mere inches above his head would hit its mark and kill him. He was curled up into a tight ball, waist deep in mud and dirty water. The sound of the zinging bullets was too much for him. He covered his ears and waited for the inevitable. "I'm going to die," he thought as he glared at the headless body that lay next to him. The man had only raised his head a mere few inches to see over the rim of the hole, but that had been enough for the Sulian gunners to kill him. Jason found himself trying to recall what the man had looked like, but he found that he couldn't. All he wanted to do was to run. But he knew it was impossible. If he got up he would become headless as well. "I don't want to die here," he whimpered. The sound of thousands of running feet filled his ears and shook the ground under him. He pressed his face into the sodden mud and prayed that the Sulians would simply pass over him. Then he felt a firm hand grab him by the shoulder and spin him around, flipping him onto his back. "Get up, Jason," howled Captain Evans, "they're coming right at us." Jason stared up at his commanding officer in blind terror. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to kill anybody. He just wanted to go home. "I wanna go home," he whimpered. "If you don't get up and fight, you won't have a home to go back to," shouted the captain, pulling Jason to his feet and shoving his Springfield rifle into his hands. "Let's go," he cried and charged towards the advancing Sulians, firing his Tommy gun from the hip as he ran. "Hurrah!" cried the hundreds of militiamen who followed him. Jason stood still as the men passed him. He could see his comrades colliding with the ranks of Sulian shock troopers, fighting them with rifle butts and bayonets. Jason watched in horror as his friends and enemies smashed in one another's heads and strangled the life out of their opponents with their bare hands. They gutted one another with their knives and drowned each other in the mud-filled craters. Jason wanted nothing to do with this madness. He turned around and started to run when he saw another militiaman running up to him. After a moment he saw that it was his best friend, Drew Wilcox. "Come on, Jason," he cried, "let's get these bastards." Something in Drew's voice strengthened Jason's resolve. There wasn't the slightest hint of fear or uncertainty in it. Drew rushed past Jason and roared as he drove his bayonet into the belly of an advancing shock trooper. "Oh, what the hell," groaned Jason as he drew out his own bayonet and fixed it to the end of his rifle. "We're all gonna die anyway. Charge." He plunged into the melee and howled like a maddened animal. He spotted his first victim, a Sulian officer. Jason aimed his bayonet for his midsection, ran as fast as he could over the muddy ground and plunged the sharpened steel into the man's side. When he tried to pull the blade out he found that it had caught on the pelvic bone. To make matters worse, the Sulian wasn't dead. The man had fallen to his knees at the impact, but he was still trying to defend himself. He grabbed the end of the rifle with his right hand and tried to unholster his pistol with his left. His officer's cap had fallen off, revealing his nearly bald head. The man glared up at Jason, murder and rage in his bulging eyes. Those eyes were screaming at Jason, "I'm going to kill you," they said. Jason pulled at his rifle but the blade wouldn't come loose. The man was screaming with each tug, entrails and blood were seeping out of his side. Each second felt like an eternity to Jason, and with each second the Sulian's free hand was getting closer to grabbing his pistol. Panicking, Jason closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the man's belly and came out his left thigh. The Sulian stopped struggling. Jason swore and clicked the man in the side of the head, knocking him over and simultaneously freeing his rifle. It was covered in gore with a loop of intestine stuck on the bayonet. Jason saw this and he doubled over, vomiting. Just then a shock trooper charged up at him, bayonet poised to kill. Jason saw him coming just in time to raise his rifle up to defend himself. He parried the blow and smashed the man across the face with the butt of his weapon. The Sulian fell to the ground and Jason jumped on top of him, stabbing him wildly in the back as he lay stunned. Just then another Sulian dog tackled him from the side and flung him to the ground. The big man held Jason down with both hands and began to choke him. Jason screamed as he fumbled for his Browning Colt .45. He pulled it out of his holster and shoved the muzzle under the man's chin. For an instant the world went still, their eyes locking. The Sulian's face was filled with sudden realization and fear, Jason's with anger and rage. The moment was shattered when he pulled the trigger and blew the man's head off. His face and glasses were splattered with his enemy's blood and brains. Jason pushed the headless corpse off and rolled over to vomit once again. "Help me," he screamed, "someone help me," but his voice was lost in the tumult. Another Sulian charged at him with a sharpened bayonet. Jason took aim and shot the man between the eyes. Slowly Jason staggered to his feet and looked around for his friends. He couldn't see them. He was surrounded by strangers. They were killing and screaming and fighting and dying. Their clothing was spattered with both mud and blood and filth. The air stank of sweat and burned gunpowder. Jason hated it. He hated everything that was around him. He wanted nothing more than to go home. That's all he wanted. Was that so much to ask for? Was that too much to ask for? Jason looked up at the sky and saw the pitch-black storm clouds that thundered and boomed overhead. He stood with his head looking up, letting the heavy raindrops wash his face clean. He had never felt so dirty in his life. He had committed the unforgivable sin of murder, and what's more, he found that he was enjoying himself. He liked killing Sulians. He wanted to see the fear and terror in their eyes. He wanted to watch the life drained from their eyes. He wanted their eyes to become nothing more than dead glass beads. Jason wanted them all dead. The only good Sulian was a dead one. "I surrender," screamed a voice from behind him. Jason spun around and saw a shock trooper standing behind him, his arms raised over his head. His helmet and gas mask had been knocked off and his face was caked in mud and streaked with blood. Jason saw that he was around the same age as the Sulian, and he could also see that his enemy was terrified. Jason stared at him for a few moments, bewildered and stunned. He suddenly realized that they were very much alike. They were both too young for this madness, they were both hopelessly frightened, and they were both murderers. They stood there in the midst of the raging battle with the rain pouring down on them as their respective comrades roared and killed each other. The Sulian was shivering pathetically, not just from fear but also from the cold. A twinge of sympathy struck Jason as he looked at his foe. Maybe, if they had met under better circumstances, they might have been friends. Maybe this Sulian wasn't like the others, he was surrendering after all. But then Jason saw the unit number on the trooper's sleeve, 169th. If it hadn't been for that armband, Jason just might have let the Sulian go, but now he determined to exact revenge, for Charlton's quarter. And not just for that massacre but also for his teacher who had died mere hours after arriving at the front, and for his friends who had died screaming and crying in their muddy trenches. This Sulian was just as guilty of their deaths as any of the others who had invaded the Agro-Caelestes. Jason's face hardened as he wrapped his forefinger around the trigger of his pistol. The surrendering shock trooper's face went white. "No," he screamed, falling to his knees, "please no." Jason's heart turned to stone. He focused on the fire and anger that burned through his body and pulled the trigger. A bloody hole the size of an orange appeared in the middle of the Sulian's chest. The shock trooper looked down at his wound and then back up at Jason, regret and sadness in his frightened eyes. Jason couldn't stand those eyes, they were too human looking. The Sulians were not humans, they were inhuman, mindless, rabid animals that needed to be put down. Jason fired again, aiming for the face this time. His first shot struck his victim under his left eye, the next on the bridge of his nose, and the rest in his forehead and right temple. The young Sulian lay dead at Jason's feet. He screamed down at him, venting his fury and frustration on his body. "Damn you!" screamed Jason, "damn you! Damn you! Damn you! He is damned," said a voice from behind, "but so are you." Jason spun around to see who had spoken. The voice was that of a woman, and it sounded evil and wicked to his ears. Jason scanned the area that was immediately around him, but all he saw were the battling soldiers and militiamen, clawing at each other in the thick mud. A coldness struck Jason at that moment, a coldness that bit him down to his bones. A needle of ice seemed to pierce his heart. He was so cold, colder than he had ever been before, and he was afraid. Not just from the battle, but now it was a deeper fear, a slow crawling dread that creeped up his spine and filled his brain with madness and terror. Trembling, he fumbled for another magazine from his ammo pouches on his belt and reloaded his handgun, drawing back the slide with a loud metallic clicking sound. "Where are you?" Jason growled, "Show yourself." "Right here," the voice answered in a whispering hiss. Jason spun and saw a tall thin figure, draped in a hooded black robe. It had a vaguely female outline and an aura of malice and hate that oozed from it like swarms of flies buzzing out of a bloated corpse. The Sulians and the Agro-Caelestians appeared to ignore it and continued to fight amongst themselves. The figure was holding a long serrated dagger in its hand, a hand that was so pale it was almost pure white. "Who are you?" asked Jason, stepping backwards. "You know who I am," the figure said, raising its head. The hood fell away and Jason saw the face of the dragon witch Byzantium. Her skin, like that of her hand, was unearthly white. Her huge green eyes dominated her face. Her long black hair flowed freely down her bare shoulders. Her full blood-red lips curled up into a sneer and she began to advance towards him. Jason felt terrified. He backed away as fast as he could, stumbling and tripping over dead bodies as he went. Byzantium smirked as she strode towards him. Jason felt panic take hold of him. He stopped moving. Byzantium was drawing closer to him, leering as she came. Jason hated that smug look on her face. He growled and raised up his pistol, aiming it with both hands. He fired and the bullet struck the witch in the cheek. She didn't even flinch. What's more, the flesh had been torn away, revealing a decaying jawbone underneath. Byzantium continued advancing and Jason kept firing, always aiming at her head. Soon all the flesh was gone and Jason was staring at a putrid grey skull. The gun clicked empty as Jason fired the last bullet. Byzantium was upon him. She grabbed him by the throat and threw him into the mud while simultaneously raising her dagger to strike. Jason screamed. He woke up with a start and a gasp. He sat up and looked around. He saw that he was lying next to the bonfire which had burned down to a pile of glowing, smoking embers. It was very early morning, the sun had yet to rise above the rim of the world. The sky above was pale and cold and cloudless. Myra and the others were still asleep close by. "Just a dream," whispered Jason as he laid back down. "No," he suddenly said to himself, "no, not just a dream." Jason felt himself go pale as he recalled his murderous actions. He had been remembering the First Battle of Murdochsville, also known as the Muddy Murdoch Massacre, where 750 militiamen fought off an attacking force of 3,000 Sulian shock troopers. It had been during the early weeks of the Agro-Sulian War, those tenuous miserable days when defeat had appeared inevitable and the Sulians were believed to be invincible. But then something strange or miraculous had happened. The Sulians had retreated from the battle. They had all fled, having lost their will to fight against the Agro-Caelestians who killed 5 shock troopers for every man that they lost. Of the 750 militiamen only 390 were left standing by the end. But of the 3,000 shock troopers nearly 2/3 had been completely destroyed. Jason could still recall the feeling of sheer disbelief that he'd felt when he saw the Sulians turn tail and run for the safety of their own trench lines. "We should have been dead," he said as he looked up at the clear morning sky. A loud snort off to his right caught Jason's attention. He looked and saw that Amaron was awake and was gazing at him. "Bad dream?" asked the great grey dragon. "Aha," Jason grunted as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "You were kicking quite a lot in your sleep," noted Amaron. "I thought that you were going to wake the others." "Did I wake you?" asked Jason. Amaron shook his large head, which rattled his dorsal spikes, and opened his cavernous jaws in a yawn. "No," said the dragon, "no you didn't. The riders did." Jason looked around but couldn't see any horsemen. Then he sat and listened for the sound of galloping hooves or the whinnying of excited horses, but all he could hear were the hissing and occasional popping coming from the fire pit. "What riders?" he asked. "I don't hear anything." "That's because you're not a dragon," smiled Amaron, his scaly lips pulling back to reveal his large white teeth. The dragon's teeth were the size of railroad stakes. "And I didn't hear them either," chuckled Amaron, "I felt them." The confused look on Jason's face nearly made him laugh. The grey dragon lowered his head to the ground and pressed his lower jaw into the soil. Then he closed his eyes and waited. After a few moments he opened his eye and looked at Jason. "I'm sensing the vibration of their footfalls," he explained. "It's a trick I learned when I was a whelpling. I used it for hunting. I press my body into the soil or against the trunk of a tree and feel for movement. Whichever part of my body feels the vibrations first tells me the direction of whatever is moving. Let me see." Amaron closed his eyes again and concentrated. "I can tell that there are about 100 of them and that they are moving rather slowly," he said after a moment's pause. "They'll be here in about 5 minutes or more." "So you've basically got a natural radar system in your jawline?" asked Jason. "Not just my jaw," said Amaron, "my whole body can feel the vibrations. My jaw is simply more sensitive to it." "Whatever you say," grunted Jason, waving dismissively at the dragon. It was too early in the morning for Jason to understand this. Half of his brain was still asleep and the other half was trying to fall back to sleep. He yawned and stood up. Jason looked towards the east just as the sun breached the distant horizon, its golden rays shooting out in all directions. A shallow mist had formed, low to the ground. The grasslands were steaming with dew in the early morning sun. Amaron turned to face the bright light. "I can see the riders now," said the dragon. Jason shielded his eyes against the sun and peered out in the direction that Amaron was looking. He couldn't see anything except for the flat grassy expanse that stretched out in all directions. "Still can't see 'em," said Jason. "Over there," said Amaron, indicating the point he was looking at. Jason followed his gaze and saw a dim outline on the plain. As it drew nearer he saw that it was Crest, Eric and the rest of the fur returning from their night-long hunt. The heads of the ponies were held low and the boys sat bowed and hunched on their backs. The whole company was moving rather slowly and had a sullen air hovering over it. "They didn't get him," mused Amaron. "So Algar got away after all," said Jason as he watched the defeated boys approaching. "I thought for sure that Crest and the others would catch him." "Did you?" asked Amaron, turning his head to face Jason. "Well, yeah, there were so many of them and Algar was all by himself." "But he wasn't alone," retorted Amaron, "he had help from one of his followers. Whoever it was cut his bonds while Tilla was playing her trick on Crest." The riders had gotten close enough for Jason to make out their downcast faces and dark circles under their tired eyes. "They look like they just lost the World Series," noted Jason. "World Series?" asked Amaron. You know, baseball," said Jason, looking back at Amaron. "I'll explain later." "I know what baseball is," snorted the gray dragon. "I've seen your kind playing it before. I also know what soccer and football are. I'm not completely ignorant of human pastimes. Though I don't see why kicking a ball between two sets of posts is so popular with you people." "It's fun," cried Jason as Crest and the vanguard of the riders reached the bonfire. The Arthurian boy dismounted his pony and sat down next to the fire, his head in his hands. "So close," whimpered Crest, "we were so close." "Long night?" asked Jason. Crest looked up at Jason with an annoyed look. His eyes were bloodshot and heavy from weariness. "We almost caught him," snarled the boy. "Algar shouldn't have gotten away." "How'd you lose him?" asked Jason. "We chased him all the way to the border of his territory," said Eric, who wobbled up to the fireside. "We were just about to recapture him and his comrade when all of a sudden the rest of his fur appeared from out of the darkness. They took us by surprise and we were forced to retreat." "He's probably back in Stagens Festning by now," grumbled Crest. "Stagens Festning," said Jason. "What's that mean?" "The words that you would use is the Fortress of the Stags," answered Amaron. "How do you know that?" asked Jason. "I'm a dragon, I speak every single last language under the sun," explained Amaron. To prove this fact he turned to Crest and said in the Arthurian tongue, "My kind are born with many gifts, one of them is the gift of tongues. I can understand everything that is said to me no matter what language a person may use." "Does that only apply to spoken words or can you read all languages as well?" asked Crest. "No, I can read them as well," replied Amaron in the common speech. "I only caught half of that," said Jason. "Well, that's easily explained," said Amaron, "you're not a dragon." As they spoke the rest of the riders rode up to the fire and dismounted their tired ponies. The poor little beasts were utterly exhausted from their night-long gallop. They grunted and snorted and stamped their aching hooves as they champed at their bits. The air was filled with the smell of their sweating. The young riders busied themselves by tending to their mounts. They brushed their shaggy coats clean and dug pebbles and stones from their iron shoes with small metal picks. The ponies whinnied with relief when their masters removed their bits and bridles. A combination of the noise, movement and smells woke Myra up. She sat up and rubbed the sleep from her eyes, looking around herself. "What time is it?" she grumbled. "Dawn," replied one of the Arthurian boys. "Dawn," she balked, "that's too early. Wake me in 3 hours." She laid back down and rolled over. "Why only 3 hours?" chuckled Jason. "Because that was the first number in my head is why," Myra grunted in reply. "Come on, Myra," said Jason. He stood up and walked over to her. "Time to rise and shine." "5 more minutes," she moaned. "Come on, Myra," urged Jason, shaking her by the shoulder. Myra growled and kicked at Jason, catching him in the ankle. Jason jumped back and hopped away from the she-elf. "Ugh, should have known better," he muttered as he sat down on the log bench and rubbed his wounded joint. Despite the fact that she was small, Myra had a strong kick and it had bruised his ankle. The Arthurian boys saw this and laughed at Jason's misfortune. Yeah, laugh it up boys, he snorted as he flexed his foot. At this time Twizel and her whelpling had awakened. The dragoness yawned and stretched her rosy red wings out to their full span. Several of the ponies whinnied and stamped nervously when she did this. The boys tried to soothe their mounts to little avail. Twizel didn't help things much when she looked over at them and bared her large white teeth in a low growl. The boys, though knowing that the dragoness would probably not eat their steeds, led them away to graze near to the creek that flowed close by. The little whelpling walked up next the smoldering ash heap and shook himself like a dog. When he saw Myra laying nearby, he chirped and approached her, making a small whining sound. He nudged her with his snout and chirped again. Scrap, she moaned in protest. Leave me alone. The little dragon chirped again and continued nudging her. Careful, Junior, warned Jason, or else you're going to get a boot up your. He never finished. Myra grumbled and kicked at the little dragon, who flapped away and dodged the blow. When he landed, he made an indignant yowling sound and glared at Myra. She squinted back at him with a look of annoyance on her face. They scowled at one another for a few moments before Myra reached out and wrapped her arms around his neck and held him close to her chest. I'm sorry, Scrap, she said as she stroked him. The little dragon's features softened and he purred contentedly, wrapping his wings around her. Don't I get an apology as well? Asked Jason. No, grunted Myra, you deserved to be kicked. Deserved it, snorted Jason. Yes you did, replied Myra, besides, look at him. Can you stay mad at a face this cute? The whelpling looked at Jason with his big mischief-filled eyes and smiled a toothy smile at him. Bah, you're hopeless, scoffed Jason. As they spoke, the boys threw themselves onto the ground and made themselves comfortable. They, like their ponies, who were presently grazing by the little river close by, were utterly exhausted from the night-long chase. The sound of snoring rose up from the mass of youngsters. Let this be a lesson for everyone to go to bed on time, said Jason. No one answered him. They were too busy snoring.